LDS Church, but it applies most especially to our temples. We have this doctrine that there are these buildings that can only be used for certain ordinances, but for no other purposes. Today we're just going to be talking about a part of the temple, the rooms that are used to present the temple endowment and how they've changed over time. And as we talk about this, I invite you to pay attention to how you feel. Just because of the nature of what we're talking about, the Spirit is going to be here teaching each of us about the importance of this ordinance, even if you haven't yet received the endowment yourself. In order to be able to study how the rooms of the endowment have evolved, we need to look at the history of the endowment. The endowment was first revealed in Nauvoo in 1842 by the prophet Joseph Smith. The prophet, feeling he wouldn't be alive for the completion of the Nauvoo temple, which he wasn't, revealed the endowment and administered it here in his red brick store. The first floor was the store, and the second floor was the type of an assembly room up here. We don't know how he prepared the room to administer the endowment, but what's important is we know there were preparations. The history of the church tells us that the whole day before, men were moving things in and out of the room, even painting a mural of a pastoral nature in the corner. So even though we don't know exactly how the room was set up, it shows us that the prophet felt, and probably had it revealed, that the endowment has this unique relationship to its structure, to its environment, to its context. And as we could see in the early temples, there were 5 specific areas that were always used to present the endowment, 5 rooms. We can see what these are by looking at a quote from Elder Talmage. He said, "The endowment teaches of the creative period, the Garden of Eden, the lone and dreary world, and the plan of redemption." This translated into 5 different rooms that were used to present the endowment in the temples. These are the creation, garden, world, terrestrial, and celestial rooms. And this is what we'll be seeing examples of as we go through the history of these temples. So after the red brick store, the Nauvoo temple was the first temple to actually administer endowments. But it didn't have rooms for the endowment because it was well under construction when the endowment was first revealed. Instead, it had an assembly hall on the first floor and an assembly hall on the second floor. So President Brigham Young administered the endowments in the attic of the temple. There was one large room that they divided into different areas with curtains, and those areas became the rooms, even though the conditions were temporary and pretty hasty. And even under these conditions, they did their best to give meaning to these rooms. For example, the area representing the garden had potted plants arranged in walkways and aisles, so that temple patrons felt as though they were in a garden. And the St. George Temple, the first temple built in Utah, actually followed the same pattern. It had 2 assembly halls, and they simply divided one of the assembly halls into different areas, and those became the rooms for the endowment. But before the St. George Temple was even dedicated, we had a special type of temple in Salt Lake City. This was the endowment house. It stood at about where the North Visitor Center now stands in Temple Square, and it was used to administer endowments and sealings while the temples of Utah were under different things set out. And it began to use architectural symbolism in these rooms. For example, the creation, garden, and world rooms all had murals on their walls depicting those respective events. What's more, the celestial room was actually located on the second floor of the endowment house, so that patrons had to go up a staircase to get into the celestial room. This is where we start seeing the symbolism coming in. If you think about it, you're going up the stairs into the celestial room, you're ascending up into the presence of God, which is represented by the celestial room. And it was on these concepts that the early temples would really build upon, and what we're going to be looking at examples of in the next period, which is expansion and progression. The next temples built in Utah were Logan, Manti, and Salt Lake. All of these temples had rooms built specifically for the endowment. All of them had the endowment incorporated to their floor plan, and all of them used a tremendous amount of symbolism in these rooms. Let's look at some examples. This is the creation room as it originally was in the Logan Temple. So you'll notice the mural on the walls. This door and these stairs is where patrons would go up to go into the next room, which is the garden room. As we go into the garden room, you'll notice it's much brighter here. Windows are starting to appear on the walls. In these temples, you didn't go from floor 1 to floor 2. You went up a few stairs with each room, progressing each time. Going up the stairs into the next room, the world room, you'll notice here the ceilings are higher, the windows are larger, the stairs and the light fixtures are more ornate. So really the concept here was as you went from room to room, you were going upwards. Things were getting brighter and larger and more ornate because you were getting closer to the celestial room, closer to the presence of God as a result of the teachings of the endowment. Here's some examples in the Salt Lake Temple. After exiting the garden room, which is this door, patrons go up this grand staircase. Right in the middle of the ceremony, they ascend an entire floor. They also see the stained glass representation of Adam and Eve being cast out of the garden, which reflects the Genesis themes present in the endowment ceremony. Let's look at Manti for an example. This is the terrestrial room, so the room right before the celestial room. You'll notice how detailed this room is. The light fixtures have become these elegant chandeliers. You have these beautiful Corinthian columns, and a great amount of detail in the woodwork and in the moldings, and even more so in the celestial room, which in all of these temples was the brightest, the most ornate, the most decorated room, because it represented the presence of God. Here's what the celestial room looks like in the Salt Lake Temple. And so really what these temples established was this really deep connection between the endowment, the ordinance, and its architecture. The fact that the ceremony didn't just tolerate the architecture, and the architecture didn't just accommodate the ceremony. They added to each other, and they gave meaning to each other, and they were almost sort of interdependent in their relationship. And this applied to all of the temples built in the first half of the 20th century, not just the temples built in Utah in the pioneer days. As we enter the next sort of revision period, we see a major change in how the endowment was used, though. This is the Swiss temple. It was dedicated in 1955. It was the first temple built overseas in Europe, served a large area, weren't very many members, and a lot of languages that it had to serve. And so the brethren decided that they would use a stationary presentation of the endowment. Or in this temple, the endowment was completely presented to patrons in one room, and then patrons moved into the celestial room at the end of the ceremony. They tasked then Elder Hinckley with the way to present the ceremony in one room, and he came up with a film presentation of the endowment, instead of a live presentation formerly used by temple workers. So this is what the ordinance room looked like in the Swiss temple at the time of its dedication. You'll notice that it basically became a movie auditorium, because that was the medium now required to present the endowment. And the church immediately started using this stationary presentation of the endowment in all new temples built after the Swiss temple. They completely switched over and never went back to making the progressive form of the endowment. Here are some more examples of what stationary rooms look like in different temples. You'll notice that they are all very plain, very simple, very clean, but drastically different, extremely different from the endowment rooms that had been built before this time period. And it's very surprising how different they are and how quickly this change was made in the construction of these new temples. What's more, the church actually went back to much of the older temples that used the progressive form of the endowment and remodeled them to become stationary. This was the fate of the temples in St. George, La Haye, Mesa, Los Angeles, and Logan. And as we sort of saw from the pictures of the Logan Temple, because of the floor plan of a progressive stage of the endowment, you can't really remodel that to become stationary very easily. So the Logan Temple was completely gutted and rebuilt on the inside. The only thing original about the Logan Temple is the walls. If you ever attend the Logan Temple, it looks like a 70s temple on the inside. And because you're not moving from room to room anymore in these temples, a lot of these architectural symbols suddenly lost their meaning because you only see one room. So in most cases, they were taken out, most notably with the murals, and most of these temples were removed. And one source from the Mesa Temple says that they were removed in bits and pieces, sort of just tearing them off the walls, because they were told they would never be used again, which is an art preservationist nightmare. So as we can look back at this and ask, well, why did the church have to do this? This was so drastic. We can see that in the 70s and 80s, without the concept yet really of smaller temples, each temple district had a larger and a growing amount of stakes in their temple district had to be available with a live presentation. So you have this trade-off. I mean, much was gained and very much was lost when we made the sudden transition to the stationary temples. So stationary became the norm until 1997, when we sort of saw the return of progression. The Vernal Temple was dedicated in that year, and it was built in the shell of the Vernal Tabernacle. Because of this, it sort of had a defined floor plan, and the church couldn't figure out how to fit the stationary presentation like they wanted into that floor plan. So they came up with what's called a two-stage presentation of the endowment. Patrons begin in one room that combines the creation, garden, and world rooms. From there, patrons move to the terrestrial room and then the celestial room. So here are some examples. This is the first room in the Kansas City, Missouri temple. You'll notice the return of the mural because the murals are appropriate for these portions of the ceremonies. Here's what it looks like in Brigham City. And many times the mural is able to reflect local scenery, so it becomes a local tribute as well. And then here what the terrestrial rooms look like in these temples. And what's interesting is because this concept was innovated right before the turn of the century when we had the spike in temple building, it was used during most of that turn of the century. And today, in terms of sheer numbers, the two-stage presentation of the endowment is the most common in the temples worldwide. Finally, we can look at some of the recent trends in temple building. Because of the spike in temple building, the average stakes per temple district has gone down again, relieving much of the pressure that they felt before. This means that the church has been able to go back and restore some of the progression that had been removed in some temples. For example, in Los Angeles in the 1990s and La Haye in 2010. It also means the church could restore progression in other temples in the future. For example, the Mesa Temple is very close to the Gilbert Temple, which will be dedicated next week. And those temples aren't very far from the Phoenix, Arizona Temple, which will be completed at the end of this year. And these two new temples, Gilbert and Phoenix, will reduce Mesa's temple district by half. So it would be a very viable option for the church to go in and restore the progression in the Mesa Temple. The same applies to the St. George Temple with the building of a temple in Cedar City, and the Logan Temple with the building of temples in Brigham City and Star Valley, Wyoming. And finally, one last interesting example, the Provo City Center Temple. A Church News article originally stated that this temple would use the 4-stage presentation of the endowment, which is very, very rare. Later, unofficial, but I think credible sources have said it will use the 2-stage presentation. However, the church is still trying to use architectural symbolism in this temple. For example, the first room will be on the main floor of the temple, and that patrons will go up a spiral staircase in the corner towers before entering the terrestrial and celestial rooms. So it shows that the church is not only trying, but is putting in these architectural symbols where it is appropriate and where they are able to. So we've covered hundreds of years in temples in about 10 minutes. What are the main takeaways we can learn from this? Perhaps number one, we can learn that it's not inappropriate to study the history of the endowment and temple ordinances from approved and appropriate sources. And that by studying the history of the endowment, it can help us to understand more about it ourselves as we attend the endowment sessions or prepare to receive the endowment ourselves. We can also learn that the endowment is basically celestial teachings adapted for a celestial world, and that obviously the Lord can adapt these teachings in a number of ways and in a number of different presentations. I have been able to attend many temples and seen each type of this presentation, and each type of presentation has helped me, because of the way it's presented, to understand more about the endowment and to understand more about the ordinances of the temple. Finally, we can learn, once again, that the endowment ordinance is the most unique ordinance in all of the church that I know of that has this relationship to its setting. No other ordinance that I know of has this relationship to where it is and its environment and its context. Baptism, you need water. Sealing, you need an altar and perhaps some mirrors. But nothing is quite like the endowment in this sense. And really, as we come to understand the concept of sacred space, it improves our understanding of these ordinances. So I invite everyone, as we attend the temple, or as we only see the temple, even as we're in our meeting houses, pay attention to your surroundings, and pay attention to the environment, and cherish that sacred